If you break your arm, an X-ray gives you this incredibly comforting, binary answer.
Right, you just look at the film.
Exactly. You look at the film, you see the jagged white line, and it's either broken or it's not. We really crave that kind of visible, undeniable proof in almost every aspect of our lives.
We love a binary. It's safe.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you step into the world of human history, and specifically when we try to look back at our own ancestors, the hunter-gatherers who represent literally 99% of the human story, that X-ray machine just shatters.
Completely shatters.
We are left staring at this intellectual landscape that is incredibly murky and honestly just filled with our own modern projections. Like for you listening right now, you probably have a very specific diorama in your head.
Oh, almost certainly.
Right, like when I say hunter-gatherer, you might picture terrified cavemen huddled in the dark, just barely surviving this brutal winter. Or, your mind could go the complete opposite direction.
And woodland innocence.
Exactly. You see these peaceful innocents living in this effortless, mystical harmony with a pristine forest. So today, we're going to completely dismantle both of those pop culture myths. Welcome to the deep dive.
I'm excited for this one. It's a profound unlearning process, really. For centuries, we have been fundamentally misdiagnosing the very foundation of human society. We treat these diverse, highly dynamic groups of people as if they were, simple static models of our past rather than complex innovators of their present.
Yeah, and to guide us through this unlearning, we're pulling from just a massive stack of anthropological and archaeological material today.
It's a heavy stack.
It is. We're diving heavily into the work of renowned anthropologist Robert L. Kelly, specifically exploring excerpts and some really insightful public reviews of his landmark book, The Lifeways of Hunter-Gatherers.
Which is fantastic. And we also have a biographical overview of Kelly's own career, which is just incredibly broad. He's done field work everywhere, from the Great Basin in the American West all the way to Madagascar and the mountains of Chile.
Right, he's been everywhere. And then on the more mathematical side of things, we are unpacking a highly technical academic paper by Carol Sick and Jeffrey Caruso. That one delves into agent-based modeling and central place foraging.
Which sounds intimidating, but we'll break it down.
We will. And finally, to really ground all this high-level theory in the dirt and the mud, we're looking at Kelly's detailed review of Gustavo Paladis' ethno-archaeological work.
Yeah, his work with the living Nukak people of the Colombian Amazon.
Right, so it's a comprehensive set of sources.
Okay.
Because our mission today, the real goal here, is to move completely away from the idea of indigenous peoples as, living fossils.
Yeah, we are going to look at the incredibly diverse, mathematically modelable, and honestly ecologically brilliant realities of how foraging societies actually function.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even look at what modern science tells us, we have to deal with the incredibly heavy intellectual baggage we are all currently carrying around.
We really do.
And to do that, we have to travel back to the 17th century. We need to look at the foundational errors of early Western thought. You basically cannot understand how we view human nature today without talking about Thomas Hobbes.
No, you can't. Hobbes is really the architect of the bleakest possible view of human origins.
Right.
In 1651, he published Leviathan. And you really have to remember the context here. Hobbes had just lived through the horrific violence of the English Civil War.
It was a very dark time.
Exactly. He looked at a society that was just tearing itself apart without a strong central monarch, and he essentially projected that trauma backward onto early humanity.
He took his current nightmare and made it our origin story.
Yeah, he famously described the natural state of humanity, which, by the way, he explicitly equated with indigenous foraging societies as a condition of, quote, continual fear and danger of violent death.
Leading to that incredibly famous, incredibly cynical quote where he describes the life of man as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
It's quite a brand.
It really is. It's catchy and it's utter despair. And it basically set the default tone for Western philosophy for centuries.
It created a rigid paradigm. So by the time we reach the Enlightenment and subsequently the Victorian era in the 19th century, you have European historians and early anthropologists viewing human history as this strict, singular ladder of progress.
The single ladder.
Right. They utilize this intellectual framework they call the comparative method.
Which, that sounds very scientific on paper. But from what I'm reading in the sources here, it was incredibly arrogant.
Yeah.
How did this comparative method actually work in practice?
Well, the comparative method rested on this core assumption of unilineal evolution. This was the absolute unshakable conviction that there is only one path of human development.
Only one way up.
Right. At the very bottom rung of the ladder, you had savagery. The middle rung was barbarism.
Mhm.
And at the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, you had, conveniently enough for the European men writing these books, European civilization.
How convenient for them.
Isn't it? So the scholars of the day believed that by looking at modern indigenous peoples, they were quite literally looking back in time at their own ancestors. They viewed contemporary hunter-gatherers as people whose intellectual and cultural development had just, well, frozen in the Stone Age.
The guys in the powdered wigs and the top hats just happened to scientifically prove that they were the ultimate evolutionary form.
Shocking, right?
It's staggering. And the specific historical examples Robert Kelly highlights in the text are almost comical in how absurd they are. Like, take Sir John Lubbock, a very prominent Victorian scholar.
Oh, Lubbock is a prime example.
He explicitly claimed that studying modern foragers to understand human prehistory was the exact same scientific process as studying modern pachyderms, like elephants, to understand prehistoric mammoths.
He literally equated studying a living, breathing, incredibly complex human culture to analyzing a mammoth fossil. I mean, he actually called them monuments of the past. He stripped them of their contemporary agency entirely.
And it gets even more extreme than that. You have William Sollas, another highly respected academic of his time, and he's claiming that the indigenous Aboriginal peoples of Australia were the direct lineal descendants of Neanderthals.
Yeah.
He looked at early 20th century Australian populations and confidently declared them a relic population of a completely different hominid species.
It's wild to read now.
And then Viljolmor Stefansson, a famous Arctic explorer, referred to the Inuit people simply as the Stone Age itself.
Just completely reducing them. And to understand the mechanics of this prejudice, like why intelligent Victorian scholars made these incredible leaps of flawed logic, we have to look at what they were actually observing and how their intense cultural bias just warped that observation.
Right, because they were seeing real things, just interpreting them terribly.
Exactly. They went out into the world and they saw hunter-gatherers moving frequently from place to place. They noticed these groups lacked heavy, permanent European-style houses. They didn't have iron plows and they didn't accumulate massive stores of wealth or private property.
And instead of asking the rational scientific question, which would be, what specific ecological problem is this constant mobility solving?
Yeah.
They completely reversed the causal arrow.
Precisely. They assumed hunter-gatherers were nomadic because they simply lacked the intelligence, the innovation, or the moral fortitude to invent farming or build permanent settlements.
Wow.
In the European mind, sedentary agriculture and the accumulation of private property were the undeniable hallmarks of a developed intellect. Therefore, a lack of property meant arrested intellectual development.
They viewed mobility as a failure to progress.
Yes. Completely missing the fact that mobility is a brilliant, highly specialized adaptive strategy to thrive in a specific, often very unforgiving environment.
Did an insane logical leap.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this, and it's like looking at someone riding a high-performance carbon fiber mountain bike today, tearing down this rugged, highly technical forest trail, and assuming they were just a living fossil of the very first Model T Ford, simply because the bicycle doesn't have an internal combustion engine.
That is a perfect analogy.
It completely misses the point. The mountain bike isn't a failed primitive car. It is a perfectly designed, highly evolved machine built for an environment where a car would be utterly useless. You'd crash a car on a bike trail in seconds.
That analogy perfectly captures the blindness of the 19th century. The Victorians were wandering through the desert looking for cars, and when they found beautifully adapted mountain bikes, they declared them primitive toys.
Yes.
And we really have to address the darker geopolitical utility of this comparative method, because this wasn't just a harmless academic mistake made in a library. It was an intellectual framework that perfectly, seamlessly supported the European colonial project.
Because if you classify incredibly diverse, complex indigenous cultures as mere relics, if you categorize millions of living people as being trapped in the childhood of humanity, you suddenly have a very powerful moral justification for colonization.
Exactly. It becomes this paternalistic narrative of elevation. The colonial powers told themselves and their citizens that they were doing these brutish savages a favor by bringing them the gifts of civilization, industry, and the concept of private property.
Or at the very least, it justified the violent expropriation of indigenous lands.
Right, because according to that Hobbesian framework, Foragers weren't using the land productively. They didn't have fences or farms. They were just, quote unquote, wandering over it.
So the 19th century view is thoroughly dismantled here. They viewed hunter-gatherers as savage troglodytes. But as we move into the 20th century, the field of anthropology begins to professionalize, right? And they push back against this Victorian arrogance, only they sort of overcorrect, don't they?
Oh, a massive overcorrection.
We laugh at the guys in the top hats, but the 20th century academics basically just swapped out the brutish, savage stereotype for a completely different, equally reductive stereotype.
The pendulum swings violently in the other direction. So in the early to mid-20th century, anthropologists like A.R. Radcliffe Brown, who was working in Australia, and Julian Stewart in North America, they were desperate to legitimize anthropology as a hard science.
They wanted to be taken seriously.
Exactly. They wanted to categorize human societies the way biologists categorize beetles. So they started creating these rigid structural models like the patrilineal horde or the patrilineal band. They were searching for the singular defining blueprint of the essential early human society.
Still assuming there was only one way to be a hunter-gatherer.
Right. They still assumed that because foragers represented our deep past, there had to be one uniform way they all lived.
They were looking for the unified theory of the caveman. And that search kind of culminates in what the anthropological texts describe as a massive watershed moment. Let's talk about the 1966 Man the Hunter Conference in Chicago. I mean, this sounds like it was the Woodstock of modern anthropology.
It really was a true paradigm shift. The conference was organized by anthropologists Richard Lee and Irvin DeVore, and it fundamentally shattered the existing consensus.
What was the consensus before that?
Prior to 1966, the overwhelming academic focus was heavily skewed toward men hunting large game. The assumption, which is still echoing Hobbes, by the way, was that life was a precarious daily struggle to spear a mammoth or a gazelle, and that failure meant absolute starvation.
Meat was survival.
That was the idea. But at Chicago, researchers brought in hard empirical data from living foraging groups, specifically Richard Lee's work with the Dobie Johansi of the Kalahari Desert, and it completely flipped the script.
They introduced what became known as the generalized foraging model, and suddenly the spotlight shifted completely away from the drama of the male hunt and focused squarely on plant food and women's labor.
The data was undeniable. It proved that in many of these societies, the steady, reliable calories gathered by women, the roots, tubers, nuts, berries, constituted the vast majority of the diet.
The meat from hunting was often just a bonus.
Exactly. A highly prized, socially important bonus, but a less dependable supplement. The researchers were finally realizing that foragers were not evolution's failures, perpetually starving on the brink of extinction. They were, in fact, master ecologists.
The sources mention a specific indigenous term that translates to Tuzudi Kausosis, masters of cleverness.
That's a brilliant term.
I love that. Masters of cleverness. And out of this Chicago conference, they formalized 5 key characteristics of this nomadic style of life. Let's break these down because they are crucial to understanding the new stereotype that was about to be born. First up was egalitarianism.
Yes. The new model argued that because foragers are constantly moving, they simply cannot physically accumulate large amounts of property.
Right.
If you have to carry everything you own on your back, wealth hoarding is literally impossible. This forced lack of material wealth inherently suppresses social hierarchies and enforces strict equality.
You can't be a billionaire if you have to carry your billions in a woven basket. Okay. Second was low population density, which the researchers noted was maintained not by starvation, but by conscious cultural controls. Third was a lack of territoriality.
Which makes sense. If your survival depends on following seasonal resources across a vast landscape, drawing strict, heavily defended borders simply doesn't make ecological sense. You have to maintain fluid boundaries so you can move where the food is.
Right. Fourth was a minimum of food storage.
Again, tied to mobility. If you store massive amounts of food, you have to stay put to defend it, which kills your mobility. Relying on the environment itself as a living storehouse prevents the accumulation of surplus, which is what usually leads to wealth inequality.
Okay, and finally, the fifth characteristic was the flux in band composition.
Meaning people moved fluidly between different family groups and camps.
Like visiting relatives.
Exactly. And this is a brilliant social mechanism for conflict resolution. Think about it. If 2 people in a small, isolated camp start fighting, it threatens the survival of the whole group.
It's too much drama.
Right. In a sedentary village, that conflict might escalate to violence because they are trapped together. But in a fluid foraging band, if you don't get along with someone, you simply pack up your tent and walk a few miles to join your sister's camp or your cousin's camp. You dissolve the social tension through spatial distance.
You just walk away. So you take these 5 traits: equality, low population, open borders, no wealth hoarding, and peaceful conflict resolution, and you hand them to Marshall Solins. He's the anthropologist who looked at this new data and coined the incredibly famous phrase, the original affluent society.
Solins's work was explosive. I mean, he looked at the time allocation studies coming out of the Kalahari in Australia. He saw that these people were absolutely not working from dawn to dusk in a desperate panic.
I mean, all.
On average, adults were spending maybe 3 to 5 hours a day acquiring food. The rest of their time was spent socializing, resting, playing with children, and engaging in complex ritual life.
3 to 5 hours a day. Meanwhile, the modern civilized Westerner is grinding out 40, 50, 60-hour work weeks, constantly stressed about rent and mortgages.
Exactly. Solins argued that affluence isn't just about having a massive abundance of things. It's a relationship between desires and means.
That's a great way to put it.
He proposed that there are 2 ways to be wealthy. The modern Western way is to try to produce an infinite amount of goods to satisfy an infinite amount of desires. The hunter-gatherer way, the original affluent society, is to desire very little and perfectly meet those finite needs with the resources at hand. By that metric, Solins argued, foragers were the wealthiest people in human history.
It's a beautiful thought, but I want to pause here and look at the cultural context, because my alarm bells are really ringing. The Chicago Conference is 1966. Solins publishes his major work in 1972. Think about what is happening in the West, particularly in America, during that exact window.
Oh, it's the perfect storm.
We are deep in the Vietnam War. The environmental movement is just waking up to massive industrial pollution. You have the counterculture, the hippie movement, thousands of young people completely rejecting corporate materialism, moving on to communes, seeking a return to the land. I have to ask, did the anthropologists just project their own anxieties onto these people?
That is the big question.
Like, did we go from calling them brutish savages to treating them as a screen to project our own modern hippie fantasies?
It is the most vital critique of that era of anthropology. The intellectuals of the 1960s and 70s were profoundly disillusioned with industrial capitalism and the military-industrial complex. They were desperately searching for an alternative way of living.
Proof that we weren't doomed.
Proof that humanity wasn't inherently greedy, violent, and destructive. When they looked at the Kalahari foragers, they didn't just see a complex ecological adaptation, they saw an Eden. They highlighted the peacefulness, the sharing, and the lack of materialism because it perfectly validated their own political critiques of the West.
It's the old noble savage trope from the Romantic era, just dressed up with spreadsheets and academic tenure.
Exactly.
And nothing illustrates how far this fantasy went, how desperately the world wanted to believe in this pure, untouched Eden, quite like the story of the Tassidae people.
The Tassidae saga is one of the most wild, controversial moments in the entire history of anthropology.
Tell me about it.
So, in 1971, the Philippine government, specifically a man named Manuel Elizalde, who was a high-ranking official under the Marcos regime, announced the discovery of an uncontacted tribe deep in the rainforest of Mindanao.
And the global media completely lost its mind.
Oh, it was a frenzy.
Yeah.
National Geographic ran a massive multi-page feature with stunning photography in 1972, and the way they were described was almost suspiciously perfect.
Suspiciously perfect how?
They were presented to the world as the ultimate Pleistocene relic. The reports claimed they lived in caves, wore leaves, used only primitive stone tools, had no agriculture whatsoever. And crucially, for a global audience that was just exhausted by the violence of the Cold War in Vietnam, they supposedly had no concept of conflict, no weapons, and literally no word in their language for war or enemy.
They were the ultimate peaceful innocents, just hanging out in a cave. But Robert Kelly notes in his work that the entire thing might have been an orchestrated geopolitical hoax.
The debate over the Tassidae raged for decades. By the 1980s, journalists and anthropologists who managed to get back into the area after the fall of the Marcos regime found something very different.
What did they find?
They found the Tassidae living in normal houses, wearing T-shirts, and speaking a dialect of a known local language. Many argued that Elizalde had essentially coerced a marginalized local group to strip naked, live in caves, and act out a Stone Age fantasy for the cameras.
Just to get on National Geographic.
Well, to secure funding, land protection, and massive political prestige.
Wow. Whether it was a complete hoax or just a heavily manipulated presentation of a vulnerable group, the real takeaway is our reaction to it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
The West swallowed it whole. We didn't apply critical scientific scrutiny because the narrative of the peaceful, not materialistic cave dweller was an ideological comfort blanket. We wanted them to be a pure reflection of our lost innocence, and we completely ignored the complex, messy realities of their actual lives.
And that is the danger. When you romanticize a group of people to serve your own philosophical arguments, you strip them of their humanity just as thoroughly as the Victorians did when they called them savages. You aren't seeing them. You are only seeing yourself.
That is so well said. So if the 19th century was blinded by arrogance and the 1960s were blinded by romanticism, how does modern anthropology finally cut through the noise? Like, how do we actually understand how these societies function without projecting our own issues onto them?
We do it by pulling back the emotional lens, looking strictly at behavioral ecology, and quite literally running the complex mathematics of survival.
Which brings us to Robert L. Kelly's actual methodological approach.
Yeah.
Human behavioral ecology. And the foundational premise here is that there is no such thing as the essential hunter-gatherer.
Right.
You cannot look at the Dobie-Juanzi in a scorching African desert or the Shoshone in the freezing mountains of the American Great Basin and say, aha, I have found the single template for all of human prehistory.
Exactly. Human behavioral ecology posits that humans are, above all else, incredibly adaptable problem solvers. The sheer diversity we see in foraging societies, the fact that some are fiercely egalitarian while others have entrenched hierarchies, some move every 3 days while others build permanent villages, isn't just statistical noise.
It's not noise that needs to be filtered out to find a true model.
Right. The variation is the point. That diversity is the direct result of human populations making highly calculated, rational decisions to maximize their survival in radically different, highly specific local environments.
And to figure out how those decisions are made, ecologists use a framework called optimal foraging theory, or OFT. And a major subset of that is central place foraging. But before we get into the heavy math, we need to define central place foraging because it's a massive evolutionary divergence for humans.
It really is. It is the behavioral trait that defines us. Most primates, like chimpanzees or gorillas, use what we call encounter foraging.
How does that work?
They move through the forest, and when they encounter a fig tree, they sit in the fig tree, eat the figs until they're full, and then move on. They consume the calories at the point of extraction.
But humans don't do that.
No, humans establish a central place, a base camp, a hearth, a cave, a village. We walk out into the environment, we hunt large game or gather heavy, calorie-dense loads of tubers, and instead of eating them on the spot, we carry that immense weight back to the central node.
Which requires an incredible amount of delayed gratification and energetic expenditure. You are actively burning calories to carry calories to a place where you're going to share them with other people.
Precisely. Central place foraging is the engine of human social cooperation. It necessitates a division of labor, complex social bonds, and sharing networks. And it creates a really fascinating logistical problem.
Which is?
How far can you walk away from your central place before the energy it costs to carry the food back is greater than the energy the food provides?
Right. If you burn 2,000 calories walking a deer back to camp, but the deer only gives you 1,000 calories, you're going to starve.
Exactly. You're operating at a caloric deficit.
Which perfectly sets up the highly technical academic paper we have by Carol Sick and Jeffrey Caruso.
Yeah.
They decided to model this central place problem using agent-based modeling, or ABM. They essentially built a complex computer simulation.
Yes. To visualize what Sick and Caruso did, imagine a massive digital grid. In the early days of optimal foraging theory, researchers used simple mathematical models that assumed a homogeneous environment.
Meaning everything was perfectly spread out.
Right. They calculated human movement as if calories were spread perfectly evenly across the landscape, like a uniform flat layer of peanut butter.
Which makes the math easy, but nature doesn't look like a smooth layer of peanut butter.
Exactly. Real environments have spatial heterogeneity. So Sick and Caruso programmed environments with different distributions of energy. In some simulations, resources were highly clumped into dense, rich patches separated by vast, empty spaces. In others, the resources were scattered more randomly or evenly.
And then they dropped digital agents, simulated hunter-gatherers into this grid.
Yes, little digital foragers.
I love the idea of these little digital foragers. How do you even program a simulated human to make survival decisions?
You code them with specific parameters. These agents have a defined visual radius to scan for food. They have memory. They can remember where high-yield patches were located in the past. They had a constant metabolic burn rate, meaning their internal battery is always draining.
Okay, so they're always hungry.
Yes. And as they harvest a digital patch, the resources in that specific grid square deplete.
Okay, so they're vacuuming up calories, draining the patch, and burning energy. How does the agent, or a real human for that matter, know when it's time to abandon their current camp and move to a new one? I mean, I know it's time to leave a buffet when they start turning the lights off, but what is the mathematical trigger in the wild?
This is driven by a concept called the marginal value theorem.
Okay, lay it on me.
It sounds intimidating, but it's an elegant, intuitive concept. Imagine you are standing in a forest picking blackberries from a massive, fruit-heavy bush. When you first arrive, the picking is incredibly easy. You are grabbing huge handfuls of berries with almost no effort. Your return rate, the amount of calories you gain per minute of effort, is incredibly high.
But I'm depleting the patch as I eat.
Right. As you strip all the easy berries from the outside of the bush, you have to start working harder. You have to reach deeper into the thorny branches, you get scratched, you have to search under the leaves. Your effort goes up, and the number of berries you get per minute drops. Your marginal value is decreasing.
So when do I leave the bush?
The marginal value theorem dictates that a perfectly rational forager will stop picking and move to a new bush the exact moment that their current dropping return rate equals the average overall return rate of the entire surrounding environment, factoring in the time and energy it will cost to walk to the next bush.
That is brilliant. It's a constant subconscious calculus. You're basically asking yourself, how good is the foraging right here, right now, compared to how good it could be over there, minus the caloric cost of the journey?
Exactly. And when Sick and Caruso ran hundreds of thousands of these simulated foraging trips, clear patterns emerged. They found that the spatial distribution of energy dramatically dictates how often a society moves.
How so?
If resources are highly clumped together, say a dense, rich forest of nut-bearing trees surrounded by 50 miles of barren scrubland, the agent's mobility rates plummet. The math says, stay at the clump until it is thoroughly exhausted because the cost of walking across the barren scrubland is just too high.
But if the environment is more evenly distributed, like a sprawling grassland with small scattered patches of roots and game, mobility goes way up.
Correct. The agents have to keep hopping from small patch to maintain their metabolic baseline. The math neatly explains the variation we see in the real world.
It's all about the landscape.
However, Sick and Caruso also discovered a crucial limitation to the purely energetic model. They found that the distribution of calories alone couldn't fully explain exactly where humans place their camps. Local affordances play a massive role.
Affordances meaning things that aren't calories, but are still totally necessary for life.
Exactly. Access to fresh water, a defensive high ground, or access to non-caloric materials like flint for tools or specific wood for bows. A perfectly rational, energetic model might tell you to camp in the middle of a dense berry patch, but if the nearest water source is 5 miles away, the human will camp at the water and walk to the berries.
Okay, I have to push back a bit here.
Go for it.
This is all fascinating, but it also feels incredibly reductive.
Yeah.
We are talking about human beings, creatures with deep emotional lives, complex languages, art, and spirituality. And we are reducing them to an algorithm.
It's a common critique.
We are turning ancient human societies into essentially a Roomba vacuum cleaner. You program a Roomba to wander a grid, vacuum up dirt, and when its internal algorithm calculates that the dirt-to-battery drain ratio is suboptimal, it navigates to a new zone. If we model humans as algorithmic Roombas, aren't we stripping away the very culture and humanity that we just criticized the Victorians for ignoring?
It is the most common and, frankly, the most valid critique of optimal foraging theory. Anthropologists who hate OFT argue exactly that. Humans are not hyper-rational, calorie-maximizing calculators.
Messy.
They are, but the proponents of the theory, like Robert Kelly, offer a very compelling defense. They argue that OFT is not claiming that humans are mindless robots devoid of culture.
Then what is the point of the simulation?
The point is to establish a rigorous mathematical baseline of strict economic survival. The math of the marginal value theorem dictates what a purely rational, perfectly optimal organism should do to survive in a given landscape. It creates a null hypothesis.
Okay, I think I see where you're going.
If we model an environment, and the rigorous math says a foraging band should move their camp every 10 days to maximize calories, but the anthropologist in the field observes them moving every 3 days, or maybe staying for 30 days,
Right.
the mathematical model isn't broken.
Right.
The model has done exactly what it was designed to do. It has illuminated a discrepancy.
It highlights the anomaly.
Yes,
Yeah.
it flags that data point and tells the anthropologist, look closely right here. Something other than just calorie counting is driving their behavior. If human behavior perfectly matches the math, it's just basic ecology. But when humans radically deviate from what optimal survival dictates, that is exactly when we know something uniquely cultural, social, or spiritual has taken the wheel. The math isn't meant to erase culture. It's meant to be the blank canvas that makes the vibrant paint of human culture visible.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The algorithm just shows us where the human messiness begins. And to see exactly what that messiness looks like, where the math breaks down and the beautiful, complex reality of culture takes over, we have to leave the computer simulation and go into the deep Colombian rainforest.
Yes. We are shifting now to the ethno-archaeological work of Gustavo Politis with the Nukak people, as reviewed by Kelly. And we need to spend some time explaining what ethno-archaeology actually is, because it is a very specific, challenging discipline.
Right, because on the surface it sounds like an oxymoron. Archaeology is the study of the dead digging up thousand-year-old rocks, broken pots, and bones. Ethnography is the study of living cultures, hanging out with people, interviewing them, observing their daily lives. Why is an archaeologist, whose primary data is usually dirt and old rocks, obsessed with following a living, breathing population of foragers in the Amazon?
Because traditional archaeologists face a massive inferential gap.
Inferential gap.
Yeah. They dig a trench, and they find a dark stain in the soil where a wooden post rotted away, maybe a cluster of cracked animal bones, and a pile of discarded stone flakes. They then have to sit in a lab and try to guess the specific, dynamic human behaviors that created that static material pattern thousands of years ago.
It's a lot of guesswork.
It is. Ethnoarchaeology bridges that gap. An ethnoarchaeologist lives with modern foraging people not just to study their mythology or kinship networks, but to meticulously observe exactly how their daily behaviors create the archaeological record in real time.
They're watching the trash being made.
Exactly.
And the sources list the mundane things these researchers focus on, and honestly, it's hilarious to imagine. You have these brilliant academics in the Amazon, meticulously cataloging where people spit out seeds, measuring the exact diameter of temporary house posts, and charting the spatial distribution of a trash pit. My absolute favorite detail from Politis's work is that he tracked the remnants of a hammock that was burned in the middle of a marital dispute.
I know, it sounds absurd until you realize the interpretive power it provides. Imagine an archaeologist digging up a site 500 years from now and finding the charred remains of a woven hammock isolated from the main hearth.
They'd come up with some wild theory.
Without ethnographic context, that archaeologist might write a whole paper speculating that the burned hammock was evidence of a dark ritual sacrifice or a catastrophic campfire accident that destroyed a dwelling. But because Politis was there, living with the Nukak, he knows the truth.
It's the physical, material signature of a husband and wife having a screaming match and throwing each other's stuff in the fire.
Exactly. It provides a desperately needed reality check for archaeological interpretation.
And the Nukak themselves provide these incredible, vivid examples of cultural life that a computer simulation simply cannot compute. Like, you observe them using the bright entrails of Paris as fishing lures, and they build these elaborate protective walls out of woven sagey palm leaves around their temporary camps. But they aren't building these walls to keep out hostile neighboring tribes or to deter physical predators like actual jaguars. They explicitly build them to block the path of the spirits of jaguars.
And this cosmological belief system is exactly where we get to test those optimal foraging models we just discussed. Politis meticulously tracked the movements of Nukak bands through the rainforest. According to the strict marginal value theorem, a Nukak band should pack up their camp and move only when the local food resources, the monkeys, the palm nuts, the fish run low.
They should move when the return rate drops below the environmental average.
Right. When the digital blackberry bush is empty, the Roomba moves.
Right.
But Politis's data clearly shows that the Nukak frequently abandon their camps when local caloric resources are still incredibly abundant. They will literally pack up and walk away from perfectly good, easily accessible food.
The algorithm is malfunctioning. The math says stay, so why on earth are they burning calories to move?
For a multitude of intensely human, non-caloric reasons. Sometimes it is purely a matter of sanitation. You have 30 people living in a clearing in a tropical rainforest. Eventually, the trash pit gets foul or the insect population explodes, and they move simply to escape the bugs.
That's practical.
Very. Sometimes they move for ritual obligations. Sometimes a member of the band dies, and the grief coupled with the belief that the deceased's spirit lingers at the site prompts them to abandon a perfectly good camp immediately.
That makes total sense. You wouldn't want to live in the exact spot of a fresh tragedy.
And sometimes, Politis notes, their motivations are even simpler. Sometimes they move purely for the sheer psychological pleasure of a change of scenery.
Just getting bored of the view.
Exactly. Or a few people in the camp will develop an intense craving for wild honey, or a specific type of fish that is only found 3 valleys over, and the entire band will uproot to satisfy that craving.
They move because they want a sweet treat and a road trip. That is so deeply, beautifully relatable. It completely destroys the idea that they're just survival machines operating on the absolute edge of starvation.
Right.
But the ecological impact of this movement is what really blew my mind reading this.
Oh, it's massive.
Their movement isn't just about extracting calories from a pristine forest. It's about actively terraforming it. Explain what happens when a Nukak band abandons a camp.
When the Nukak build a camp, they chop down small trees and open a hole in the dense rainforest canopy. During their stay, they discard thousands of seeds from the fruits they eat into their trash pits, and frankly, they leave behind nutrient-rich human feces around the perimeter of the camp.
Fertilizer.
Exactly. So when they abandon the site, you suddenly have a patch of highly fertilized soil being hit by direct sunlight in the middle of the jungle.
And nature just takes over.
It explodes. Those abandoned camps turn into what ecologists call wild gardens. Over a few years, that small clearing becomes densely packed with edible fruit trees, medicinal plants, and tubers. The Nukak aren't just passively wandering through a static, untouched wilderness. They are actively, sequentially constructing a massive, sprawling orchard across the entire Amazon basin. When a band returns to that general area a decade later, they aren't foraging blindly. They are reaping the harvest of their ancestors' past mobility.
That completely changes how we should view the Amazon. It's not an untouched wilderness. It's an ancient, deeply managed, anthropogenic landscape.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to pivot slightly to one of the most surprising details in Politis' work. Let's talk about children.
Yes, the chaos factor.
The field notes indicate that archaeologists studying these groups are intensely obsessed with kids' toys and the tiny playhouses children build. Why on earth is a child's toy a critical data point for understanding human evolution?
Because if you want to understand how a campsite is structurally organized and how to interpret it thousands of years later, you have to understand who is actually moving the dirt. It turns out that children are a dominant, chaotic force in shaping the archaeological record.
Think about your own childhood, or just how kids play today.
Exactly. They don't respect the tidy, functional zones adults set up. They drag tools out of the work area. They lose things in the bushes. They build little miniature camps. They scatter debris everywhere.
They're entropy machines.
That's the perfect term for it. Politis observed that the spatial distribution of children's play areas, the tiny playhouses they build, and the scattered, discarded toys are the ultimate, definitive archaeological signature of a residential family camp.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to a temporary specialized hunting outpost that was only used by a small group of adult men for a few days. If adult men just sit around a fire sharpening spears, the archaeological footprint is very tight, very specific.
Very organized.
But when kids are present, they spread the material culture out in a massive, messy radius. The children literally dictate the final disposition of artifacts in the soil. If an archaeologist wants to definitively prove that a site was a true home where families lived and reproduced, they have to look for the spatial chaos created by kids.
So we have this tension presented in the texts. Politis uses all of this incredible ethnographic detail, the jaguar spirits, the craving for honey, the wild gardens, the chaos of children, to heavily critique the human behavioral ecology approach.
Right.
He essentially argues that the computer models are soulless, hyper-rational, and fail to capture the true essence of human life. But Robert Kelly, who champions behavioral ecology, defends the math. How does Kelly reconcile a belief in jaguar spirits with the optimal foraging algorithm?
Kelly's counter-argument is brilliant because he points out that these two approaches are not mutually exclusive. They are symbiotic. Let's use a specific example. Suppose the mathematical model analyzes the local Amazonian environment and calculates the return rates of every animal.
Okay.
The math definitively predicts that the nucat should absolutely be hunting and eating tapirs. Tapirs are massive calorie-dense animals. Ignoring them makes zero energetic sense.
Right. If you're a purely rational Roomba, you hunt the tapir.
But the ethnographic observation and the archaeological bone counts show that the nucat never eat tapirs. Police might say, see, your math is wrong. They ignore the best food source. But Kelly argues the math isn't wrong. The math has just successfully isolated the precise boundary of a cultural taboo.
The deviation proves the rule.
Exactly. Because the math established a firm baseline of what ecological rationality looks like, we can definitively prove that the nukat's avoidance of tapirs is not an ecological accident, and it's not because they don't know how to hunt them.
It proves that avoiding tapirs is a deliberate, highly costly cultural choice.
The culture is willing to absorb a massive energetic penalty to maintain a spiritual belief. The rigorous math doesn't erase the culture. It acts as a highlighter pen, clearly outlining exactly how powerful that cultural belief truly is.
That completely resolves the tension for me. The math and the ethnography really do need each other. Okay, so synthesize all of this. We've established that the fundamental nature of these foraging societies involves constant mobility, whether they are moving because the algorithm tells them to chase calories or because they're dodging jaguar spirits and craving honey.
Mobility is everything.
And we established earlier, the 1960s model, that this constant mobility inherently suppresses the accumulation of wealth and enforces a fierce, leveling egalitarianism. Nobody gets to act like a king if you have to carry everything you own on your back.
Correct. It is a social and ecological system that actively, structurally prevents the concentration of power.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question.
The big one.
If human beings lived as aggressively egalitarian, highly mobile foragers for 99% of our existence on this planet, how did it all go wrong? How did humanity ever end up with billionaires and despotic kings and massive standing armies and the crushing wealth gaps we see today? How do we fall into the trap of hierarchy?
It is arguably the most profound, consequential question in all of sociology and anthropology. And the public reviews synthesizing Robert Kelly's work on the origins of political order provide a terrifyingly logical, step-by-step breakdown of exactly how that egalitarian trap was sprung.
It wasn't an overnight revolution.
No. It outlines 4 very specific, sequential ecological conditions that must be met for a fiercely equal foraging band to morph into a stratified society.
I want to walk through this process carefully because it essentially charts the birth of modern civilization. And the first condition, the absolute prerequisite for inequality, is the death of mobility.
Yes. Condition 1 is sedentism. The nomadic lifestyle must stop. The group has to decide to cease their wandering and settle down in one permanent location.
But based on everything we've discussed, why would they ever do that? If mobility is their primary defense mechanism against starvation and conflict, people don't just stop walking for no reason.
They don't. They only stop when the local landscape offers them an ecological deal they simply cannot refuse. This almost always occurs when a highly mobile band stumbles upon a localized, hyperabundant, and rapidly renewable resource.
Like what?
The classic archaeological example is a fantastic fishing spot located at a sharp bend or a bottleneck in a major river.
A salmon run or something similar.
Exactly. The band realizes that there is an endless stream of high-quality protein literally swimming past them every single day. The caloric math radically changes. They look at each other and say, why are we walking 10 exhausted miles a day through the brush digging for tubers when we can just sit on this riverbank and pull an infinite supply of fish out of the water?
It makes perfect sense. I would absolutely stop walking too. The energy return rate is off the charts.
Yeah.
So they build permanent huts by the river. What is the second condition?
Condition 2 is that the abundant resource must be controllable. This is vital. You cannot build a fence around a migrating herd of caribou that ranges over 1,000 miles. But a specific bend in a river, a narrow mountain pass where herds are forced to funnel through. You can physically occupy, demarcate, and defend that specific point on the map. You can control the access.
Okay, so we have a group that has settled down, and they have physically occupied the ultimate fishing hole. They are defending their territory. What is the third condition that sparks the hierarchy?
Condition 3 is the pressure cooker. It must be a resource that must be controlled. This introduces the variable of population density.
Explain that.
Once a group settles at the fishing hole, their caloric intake skyrockets and their population begins to grow. but the surrounding landscape is still full of other nomadic foraging bands. In the old days, if those nomadic bands were hungry, the ethos of egalitarian sharing dictated that you always let them forage in your area.
You share the land.
But now, the settled group does the math. They realize that if they allow absolutely anyone from the surrounding environment to come and fish at their specific river bend whenever they want, the hyperabundant resource will be overfished and depleted.
And the settled group, who have lost their nomadic skills, will starve.
Precisely. Their very survival now absolutely depends on restricting access. They have to aggressively guard the riverbend. The ethos of universal sharing dies, replaced by the concept of strict territorial ownership.
Oh, wait. I see how this creates conflict between groups. Like the river people are defending the spot from the nomadic people. But how does that create a rigid hierarchy, a class system between individuals? How do we get lords and peasants out of a guarded fishing hole?
This is where we witness what I like to call the birth of the tax bracket.
Okay, I'm listening.
Let's play out the scenario. Imagine Group A is the band that arrived first, settled down, and claimed the fishing hole. They have abundant food and permanent homes. Group B is a neighboring band, still practicing nomadic foraging in the surrounding hills. One year, a terrible climate event occurs. A severe drought.
So Group B is in trouble.
Group B's wild resources dry up entirely. They are facing imminent starvation. Out of desperation, they walk down from the hills, approach the river bend, and beg Group A for access to the fish.
And Group A has a choice to make. They have to protect the fish to ensure their own survival, but they probably have kinship ties with Group B. They don't want to just watch their cousins starve on the riverbank.
Exactly. So the leaders of Group A propose a compromise. A deal is struck. They say to Group B, "We will allow you to come down to our river bend and fish. We will save your lives. But in exchange for granting you access to our controlled resource, you must give us 50% of everything you catch." Right there, in that single, seemingly pragmatic transaction, institutional inequality is born. Think about the dynamics that just shifted. Group B is doing all the strenuous physical labor of catching the fish, but Group A is extracting surplus value from that labor simply because they own the location.
Group A is literally collecting rent.
Yes. Group A now has a massive surplus of food that they did not have to expend physical energy to acquire. This surplus grants them the most dangerous commodity in human history: permanent leisure time.
And what do they do with that time?
They can now use that surplus food to feed specialists who don't produce their own calories. They can feed full-time warriors to further guard the river. They can feed priests to invent religious justifications for why the river belongs to them. They gain immense political leverage. Meanwhile, Group B is reduced to a permanent underclass, trapped in a cycle of paying rent just to survive.
It is chillingly recognizable. It's the exact blueprint for feudalism, for landlord-tenant dynamics, for the entire extraction economy. It all starts with the toll gate at the river bend.
It does.
But there is a fourth condition listed in the synthesis. And this is the one that completely blew my mind because it shifts from macroeconomics to intensely intimate biology and psychology. Condition 4 is child spacing. What does the gap between siblings have to do with the rise of kings and billionaires?
It has everything to do with altering the fundamental baseline of human personality. To understand this, we have to contrast the biology of a mobile mother with a sedentary mother.
Yep.
In a highly mobile foraging society, a woman has to physically carry her infant almost constantly while she walks miles a day gathering food. Human infants are helpless. You physically cannot carry a 3-year-old toddler, a newborn infant, and 40 pounds of gathered tuber simultaneously. It is calorically and logistically impossible.
So how do they manage it?
Through biology and culture. Nomadic foragers utilize extended breastfeeding, which naturally suppresses ovulation, a mechanism called lactational amenorrhea. Combined with a low body fat percentage from high activity and certain cultural taboos, this reliably spaces children out. In a traditional nomadic band, a mother will have a child roughly every 4 to 5 years.
Okay, a 4 to 5 year age gap between siblings.
Now, I want you to really think about what that specific age gap means for the psychological development of a human child. If you are born into a mobile foraging band, you have 4 or 5 full years where you are the sole, undisputed infant of your mother.
Right.
You have 0 direct peers competing for your mother's breast milk, her immediate physical warmth, or her psychological attention. You are carried constantly. Furthermore, in a small band of maybe 25 people, there might only be 1 or 2 other children your exact age.
So there isn't a massive cohort of toddlers fighting over scraps.
No, you are indulged, protected, and patiently socialized by multiple older siblings and aunts. You are not fighting a daily, desperate battle for survival against a sibling who is only 10 months older than you. The baseline psychological setting that is programmed into your developing brain is one of relative abundance, security, and relaxed cooperation.
Okay, so that is the nomadic mind. Now, what happens when they settle at the river bend?
Everything changes. When society becomes sedentary, the biological and logistical constraints on women are completely lifted. You aren't walking 10 miles a day. Because you have a permanent camp, you can safely put a toddler down. Crucially, sedentary societies, especially agricultural ones, but also settled fishing ones, have access to grains or starchy foods that can be boiled into soft mushes.
Baby food.
Exactly. This means a mother can wean an infant off breast milk much earlier, supplementing their diet with mush.
And when she stops breastfeeding constantly, ovulation returns.
Exactly. The natural birth interval collapses. The gap drops from 4 to 5 years down to 1 or 2 years.
Oh boy. So suddenly, a mother doesn't just have one infant. She has a newborn, a frantic 1.5-year-old, a demanding 3-year-old, and a chaotic 4-year-old, all at the exact same time.
Yes. And dive deep into the psychology of that domestic environment. Those 4 siblings are now locked in a fierce daily competition for a finite pool of maternal resources. They are fighting for milk, for physical affection, for the mother's exhausted attention. The mother is stressed, drained of energy, and simply cannot instantly soothe every cry or indulge every whim.
The environment has shifted from secure abundance to intense scarcity.
And the children's brains adapt to that scarcity. They learn very early on that attention must be violently fought for. They learn that resources are limited, that they must assert themselves over their siblings to get what they need.
Wow.
This fundamental shift in early childhood development, driven entirely by the cessation of mobility and changes in diet, alters the baseline human personality. It shifts the entire society away from the relaxed, sharing-based cooperation of the nomad and hyperstimulates intense, status-seeking, competitive behavior.
So, synthesizing all of this, are you telling me that political dominance, the very concept of a stratified hierarchy, didn't originate because some brilliant sociopath invented a better spear and conquered his neighbors?
It's much more mundane than that.
It originated because a group settled down by a river, start charging rent for fish, and simultaneously, mothers had 4 toddlers under the age of 5, driving everyone to levels of unprecedented competitive stress.
It is the ultimate compounding effect. You combine the massive economic leverage of controlling a localized resource with an entirely new generation of psychologically competitive, status-anxious children who are wired to fight for dominance, and you have the perfect, inescapable recipe for a stratified, hierarchical, unequal society. It provides a profound, biologically grounded explanation for the origins of sociology.
That reframes absolutely everything I thought I knew about human history. And if we extrapolate this biological reality to our modern world, I can't help but look at our modern school system.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about how we educate children. We take hundreds of children of the exact same age, an artificial, massive demographic clump that literally never existed in a small foraging band, and we confine them all together in a single building.
It's intense.
We are essentially mass-producing the exact conditions that hyperstimulate competitive, status-seeking behavior. We are putting our children in an artificial pressure cooker of intense peer competition that mobile foragers actively, structurally engineered their societies to avoid.
It is a profoundly unsettling parallel. We have built modern environments, from our schools to our corporate structures, that demand and relentlessly reward the exact opposite psychological traits of our foraging ancestors. We have normalized the stress of the crowded river bend.
Man, this has been an absolutely incredible, exhausting, and fascinating journey today. Just to summarize the massive ground we've covered.
We covered a lot.
We started by unpacking the heavy, arrogant baggage of 19th century thinkers like Hobbes and Lubbock, who looked at foragers and saw only brutish, primitive relics of the past. We watched the pendulum swing to the 1960s, where academics projected their own anti-war hippie fantasies onto indigenous peoples, culminating in the romanticized hoax, the Tassade.
Right.
We then sobered up with the rigorous algorithmic math of central place foraging, using agent-based models to prove that mobility is a calculated survival strategy. But we immediately complicated that sterile math by going into the Amazon with Gustavo Paredes, discovering the messy, beautiful realities of ethnoarchaeology, where people move camp to dodge jaguar spirits, leaving wild gardens and scattered toys in their wake.
The human element.
Exactly. And finally, we track the devastating origins of human inequality back to a settled bend in a river, the invention of rent, and a fundamental shift in how human babies are spaced and socialized.
It is a testament to how incredibly fluid, adaptable, and occasionally tragic the human experience really is. There is no single human nature. There are only human responses to specific conditions.
But before we sign off, I know there is one final paradigm-shifting thought embedded in the sources that we need to address. Something that builds on everything we've discussed today, but flips the perspective on modern hunter-gatherers one last time.
Yes. Throughout this entire deep dive, we've spent a lot of time analyzing the intense egalitarianism of modern hunter-gatherers. We've talked about their enforced sharing, their deliberate lack of hierarchy, and their constant restless mobility.
Right.
And the default assumption, even among progressive thinkers, is to view this as the ancient default of human nature. We think, this is the pure way we lived before civilization and agriculture ruined us. But the anthropological data prompts a much more provocative, radical question. What if it isn't a default at all?
What do you mean? If it's not the default, what is it?
What if the strict aggressive equality and the constant mobility of groups like the Dobijuhuansi in the Kalahari or the Nukok in the Amazon is not some passive, fragile retention of the Stone Age? What if it is a highly evolved, hyperactive reaction?
A reaction to what?
Look at history. For thousands of years, these foraging groups have existed on the extreme margins of aggressively expanding agricultural, hierarchical, state-level societies. They have lived next door to societies with despotic kings, crushing taxes, forced labor, and slavery.
They have seen the riverbend societies.
They have seen them, and they know exactly what they are. What if choosing to remain a hunter-gatherer today, enforcing radical equality, violently refusing to accumulate wealth, and remaining perfectly, elusively mobile is a deliberate, highly calculated strategy to avoid being swallowed by the miseries of the hierarchies growing around them?
You're saying their way of life isn't a relic, it's a protest.
Exactly. What if being a hunter-gatherer in the modern world is an active, ongoing, fiercely intentional act of political defiance?
Wow. An act of political defiance. That completely, utterly shatters the diorama. It means that when you go to a museum or watch a documentary and you see that image of a foraging group, you aren't looking at the helpless, primitive past. You might be looking at the most enduring, highly strategic resistance movement in human history.
It changes everything.
It really does. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It really forces you to question every assumption you hold about the nature of progress, about what we casually dismiss as a simple society, and the true hidden psychological and social costs of settling down. Keep questioning, keep diving, and we will see you next time.